Welcome, everybody, to this segment of our Industry Influencers podcast series. And I'm really thrilled today to have Dave and Abhi on the call with me from Deloitte, part of our strategic partnership with Deloitte. We're really focused in on some things in the insurance industry, and we're going to have a really fascinating conversation today, specifically around group and benefits. So Dave and Abhi, welcome.
Thank you, Denise.
Why don't you both give a little bit of a background on yourself? Dave, if you could kind of talk about Deloitte and our strategic partnership first, that would be great. So why don't you go ahead, Dave?
So my name is Dave Schmitz. I've been doing insurance operations technology work for north of 35 years now, and I actually do it across lines of business. So I get to see how things work, where their strengths and weaknesses across the different lines between life annuities, reinsurance, P&C and group. With regards to Majesco, we've had a relationship with Majesco that goes back probably 20 years at this point. More recently, in the last 8 years, we've been doing a lot of work where we're working jointly side by side on implementation at clients, as well as helping them in client implementations and also starting to roll into more of a systems integrated flavor in our support of Majesco. Abhi?
Hi, Denise. Nice to be here. Abhishek Bakre. I'm also a leader within Deloitte's insurance practice. My focus early on in my career was more banking capital markets. And over last probably 8 or 9 years, I've just solely focused on group and life carriers, really helping them architect transformations, really leveraging technology to drive strategic growth, transforming how they operate, and really helping them create that value for the customers they serve. So happy to be here.
Great. For the audience, Dave and I've known each other for quite some time, and it's been fun to, as each of us have traveled this path of insurance, kind of see how things have changed over the years, and it's been a pleasure getting to know you, Abhi. One of the things that I wanted to talk about that we've been spending a lot of time talking about as we're looking at some kind of joint go-to-market opportunities is, what are the market forces facing the group and voluntary benefit insurance market? And what are insurers required to kind of look at this differently in defining a comprehensive strategic response rather than, probably what they've been doing probably for the last 10 or 20 years, which is much more of a tactical operational focus?
Yeah, Denise, I'll give you a what I'll call a pre-COVID view of that, right? Because I think there's a pre-COVID and a post-COVID view of the world. From a pre-COVID perspective, some of the things that they were facing, from a competitive perspective, there's a lot of M&A going on, both in the carrier market and the broker market. And in the broker market, that was creating more concentration in terms of and more power in the hands of the brokers. And I think there was also a lot going on, and it still is going on around the ecosystem domain and how you play with all the different participants in the overall value chain. Buyers were front and center in terms of the diversity and empowerment that customers are getting and how that's impacting the experience expectations that they have. The changes in work, which has only been accelerated by COVID. And share of wallet's always been a challenge for group in terms of, as healthcare costs continue to rise, trying to get the non-health side appropriate, share of wallet. From a innovations perspective, I think, and this is based on our benchmarking work. We do a pretty extensive benchmarking study every few years. And, the data modernization going on in the group space is still in initial stages across most carriers. And the ability to use that data and really drive analytics into the business is limited by where they're at in that data modernization journey. So I think that's another focus area. And then if you look at the insurtechs, right, there's some, what was it? I think there was 12 billion, invested in the last few years in insurtechs. So lots of, new things coming to the market, lots of new players coming to the market, lots of potential partners in the market, not to mention potential new entrants. So I'll pause there. And Abhi, do you have any things you might want to add to that?
Yeah, I think on the ecosystem side, that continues to be one of the most strategic focus, as Dave sort of alluded. Group is an interesting industry because it's really an ecosystem, from your HRIS, HCM, payroll, to Ben admin platforms and enrollers. And from a carrier vantage point, how do you build the right set of digital connections that drive that efficiency? So we continue to see a lot of emphasis and focus and investments within that space as carriers, try to go after that greater share of wallet, if you will. And one thing probably, Dave was getting to or did not get to the regulatory landscape, right? So that continues to evolve. If you look at, pretty much, 50 states, there is already a regulation or are in the process of, regulating more paid family leaves, paid disability leaves, and those sort of laws that now the employers have to comply with, right? And how you're going to sort of manage that both at the federal, state, or jurisdictional level is going to be challenging in terms of not just the payments but also the operations and exchange of data and doing the offset calculation, right? And still driving that experience that is empathy driven in moments that matter for a customer who might be struggling with something, right? So that's continues to evolve in the market, and then data privacy continues to be top of the mind. And what's interesting these days around innovation is there is some regulation that's starting to creep up, which is going to be interesting to watch how that plays out.
Yeah. So Dave, you kind of were hitting on an area, where we often talk about kind of true group and then voluntary benefits. And voluntary benefits has really been in a product area that has really seen some growth. And growth from the standpoint of more employers wanting to offer voluntary benefits, possibly a different kind of demographic of the next generation workforce, and or because it's a way that they can try to retain existing customers or existing employees in a different way, in a really cost-effective way. And I think coming out of COVID, you said, about COVID, is that I think there's an increased interest now, particularly around some of the voluntary benefit products that people maybe didn't have pre-COVID that now they're taking a reconsideration for. Want to kind of talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And, I'll take COVID even a little more broadly because, when I look at recessions, let's go back to, 2008, 2010, the last big recession. It was a much more, I'll call it consistent recession across the economy. And with COVID, it was much more uneven, right? You had, very specific impacts in certain industries and certain geographies, much more than others. It was very uneven. And the recovery we're seeing is uneven also. And so that's created a different dynamic. And depending on, what products you are offering, what clients you focus on, carriers were impacted differently by that. And just all those factors we went over a little bit ago were impacted by COVID too. And I'll get into the voluntary piece too, but just, I was talking about the M&A activity that was going on. Well, that slowed down a lot with COVID, right?
Yeah.
The broker consolidations, the same thing. And the volume of quoting activity diminished significantly. People are like, okay, not going to mess with that. Fewer face-to-face meetings, not as much switching going on. In terms of customer expectations, we were talking about how, the diversity and, requiring perhaps greater focus on, your customer and what they're looking for, more personalization. Well, with now COVID, all of a sudden the digitization expectations just went through the roof for everyone. And even from a future of work perspective, I think it accelerated that in terms of, kind of changing how some things are defined. Okay, so what is work, right? When you're working from home. So I think there were a lot of impacts. Abhi was talking a minute ago about data privacy and security. Fact is that the more you're pushing online, all of a sudden data privacy security becomes even more important and more of a risk based on the volume. And even with everybody's workforce is working remotely and the data and privacy and security risks there. So COVID had, a huge amount of risks and changes to what we're driving the economy, a year ago and how those have shifted. And then the question is, how will those shift back, going forward? Move to voluntary, I think, is a function of a few things. I mean, one of it is cost shifting. Employers have been, over, it's been a trend for years, trying to shift some of the burden of benefits costs. And that it'll be interesting to see whether that continues or, who knows, could COVID actually reverse that a little bit where benefits are now considered even more important and more of something that employers want to invest in for their employees based on the dynamics of the market. regardless, I think there's still, more and more potential movement towards the gig type of economy and gig type of work, which would foster more voluntary benefits kinds of opportunities. Everybody is investing in it. Everybody's putting it out there. But when you look at it as a percentage of the overall market, it's still a relatively small percentage of the overall market.
But profitable though.
Very profitable. Yes,
Yeah.
that's true.
So,
Very profitable.
yeah.
Profitable and fast growing, but fast growing on, we were working with a client recently where they're looking at, double digit growth in that area, but a 2% growth on their current book, dwarfs, 30% growth in a very small area. So, part of it is putting the right amount of focus on it in the context of the broader business.
Yeah, I was just last week, I was hosting our annual group insurance CIO forum that's attended by pretty much, top 20, carriers. And there was an interesting concept, that was coined. They called it the last mile. And what that really meant was, from a sales standpoint, as you're looking to close and an opportunity, right? How do you make sure the infrastructure is there, especially because some of the brokers are very regional, part of load in terms of as basic as Wi-Fi, and as they're closing deals, how do you go about when you cannot sort of meet the persons, right? Like, how do you go about closing that deal? That was very interesting to me, as we talk about in the middle of COVID or post-COVID to some extent, about sort of an acceleration around digital transformation initiatives, everything going online, but even some of the basic things and how they were hurt and how that affected the business. In terms of the other question around voluntary, that will continue. We've been seeing that will continue to, as sort of employers push more towards the employees. We've seen that over the last 10 years. Of course, that there is a broader discussion around, what other voluntary products you can offer, right? Like pet insurance as an example, or relief for student loans as an example. And ultimately, it drives down to how do I access that customer or that end employee, because this is a B2C market, right? The access to that data and the access to platforms and the customer hubs where the employees interact with the employer or the insurer, how do you gain control and be able to sell more voluntary products? That's going to be interesting space again to watch and see how that evolves. And technology obviously will continue to play a big role within that as well.
And even keep them as a customer if they decide to leave the place of employment and decide they want to keep that insurance from a portability standpoint, because the customer cost acquisition is significantly less then.
Yep. And then you're getting into a completely different territory altogether, right? Because that is where now you're transitioning from sort of, the group construct into more like, individual construct.
Yep.
And even more important on the life side, right? Because that model, that pricing is very much driven by the individual himself or herself, right? How do you then price that effectively? And then there's a lot of disruption just going on in life as well.
The other aspect we didn't talk about is what is the impact on the business of COVID. And I think there were, multiple different, aspects to them. One of them is, access to medical professionals, right, was significantly restricted for a good period of time. And think about, medical underwriting or, disability case management and the lack of that access to doctors and what that had to do with it in terms of, loss ratios around life picked up. And, with the big surge, the second wave, probably picked up some more in the, fourth quarter, first quarter of this year. Disability usually lags these kind of bubbles. And so we expect that to be showing a little bit more increase. Dental, on the other hand, was the opposite, right? Because no one was going to the dentist. So we had a big reduction, or a big improvement, I should say, in results there. But that could have impacts too, where going forward, people look at it and say, well, I want, a minimum loss ratio in my book to make sure that something like this happens again, my people aren't overpaying, as an example. And so just from an operations perspective, forgetting the fact that you're moving everybody remote, having to learn how to work and operate your entire organization remotely, I think there are a lot of business impacts on the outcome side of group business too.
And that really kind of gets into an area that we've been talking about, is really that how do insurers begin to kind of reevaluate their overall business operating model? And one of the concepts you guys have come up with is this concept of respond, recover, and thrive, really kind of coming out of COVID. Kind of talk a little bit more about that in terms of how you're seeing insurers reevaluate that business operating model. And what does that really mean?
Abhi, do you want to pounce on that one? I know operating model is one of your passions.
Sure. So few different things, right? Denise, I mentioned earlier, there was a continued focus on digital, and digital to me is beyond just your sort of, your portals and your UI, right? Full scale digital transformation sort of is front to back, all obviously hitting all aspects of your value chain, especially, your back end sort of, core operations itself. So that accelerated, right? In the absence of in-person visits, because really insurers traditionally have, underinvested or were in the process of investing. So that has, accelerated, those investments. And now they're forced to think things around, how do you operate digitally? That also have issues around, okay, in my current world where I'm still encumbered by, old co-operations and technology landscape, as I move towards a new sort of, digital operating model, how do I change my thinking and ways of working from the old to new? How do I think about those core chassis, platform implementations in a manner that doesn't disrupt my existing business, but also how do I grow that greenfield in a much more, thoughtful and a scalable manner? And how do I move people over, right? Mm-hmm. And how do I increase the staff and the ramp up of the folks, right? How do I migrate my customers onto that new chassis? And what does that mean from a sales standpoint? What does that mean to a distribution standpoint? If you look at brokers, they obviously don't want to change anything that is not broken. So how do I still incentivize them to move to the new platforms, right? So a lot to unpack there, a lot to talk about. Would love to, if you have any specific topic area that you want to dive into, happy to go down. But it's really, operating model is everything, from your strategy to products to operations to technology, and then talent itself, right? And that collective internal ecosystem sort of defines how you operate in the market.
A nice little topic. And to go back to the the model you were talking about, Denise, with respond, recover, thrive.
Yeah.
And respond, it was actually surprising, I think, how well the group insurers were able to react and be able to operate relatively seamlessly in short order in the remote world. Talking to so many of the carriers, they were able to adapt fairly quickly. There were some hiccups here and there. Overall, I think they were all very pleased with their ability to do that.
I think across the board, the industry overall really was able to, which I think surprised a lot of people.
Yeah.
And one key point over there to note is, some carriers are probably most of our clients. There was also sort of, moral question associated with it. And if you're going on a disability with COVID, so you see a lot of employees increasing coverage, right? Because if you look at, your traditional sort of disability and what it covers, who thought COVID now hit, right? So they did sort of, offer sort of relief, and they did offer payments and benefits, which was the right thing to do, even when sort of, the coverage wasn't there, right? So that was heartwarming to see, just as an industry standpoint.
Yep, absolutely.
And then when we move on to recover and thrive, which are, two different flavors of the same thing in my mind, it's really reacting to some of the acceleration that happened. And I think that acceleration happened in probably three different places. One was around, customer expectations and the digital experience. And that's whether it's, broker, your distribution channel or your employers or employees. Everybody's looking for that digitization and that lit a little fire under everybody in terms of, both short-term and long-term. How do we get there? The change in the workforce and people working at home, and the amount of gig work that will or will not, persist. And I think I referenced it before, the definition of work. What is the definition of work when you're working at home? Some of the contracts might need to now take a look at that in terms of how that's defined. I'm taking a break at the house and I trip down the stairs. Is that a work accident? Right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of questions. And I think the other one is around trying to recognition in terms of some of the technology gaps they have. And the emphasis on some of these hasn't changed. I think, the working on the ecosystem, that work has never stopped. I don't think anybody blinked. Everybody's still working on trying to interconnect with the ecosystem. But I think it's pushed people to figure out how to better digitize, how to better use data, how to improve the security. It's accelerated things that were to a certain extent in process already and made them more important. The only area where they've probably been saved a little bit is probably with new entrants to the market. I think in this kind of
True.
environment, it's probably limited the threat of people coming in from the outside. I just haven't seen as much of that, and it doesn't shock me given the environment.
So just on that previous note that Dave mentioned, and all of this, right? Like, and just if you look at like overall industry, like over the last few years, that there have been cost pressures already, right, from an operation standpoint. And the biggest question as we talk to clients that they're grappling with, okay, acceleration of digital transformation, okay, that does mean investment, right? That means infusion of capital into some strategic initiatives, whether that's core modernization or other sort of major initiatives. How do you still continue to do that when the cost pressures are continuing to mount, right? So that's going to be a very key issue that they will continue to grapple with. How in the high pressure cost reduction environment, how do I still sort of make those investments and drive that digitization? So that will be something that they'll grapple with.
I think instead of, Dave, to your point of new kind of startups coming into the market or new entrants into the market, what seems to be happening is a little bit of a double down in investment in some of the existing ones that have been emerging in the market. I just think it was today or yesterday, Beam Dental, that digital first dental insurer, they secured another 80 million in funding, a new series. I think there's a maturity of some of those business models that enter into the market that may be accelerating as a result of COVID. Kind of back to your point about thriving post-COVID.
Yeah, good point. Good example.
Yeah. So thanks for joining us here on part one with Dave and Abhi. And I look forward to part two of the conversation with Dave and Abhi. It will be another fascinating take on what is happening in the L&A group and voluntary benefit space. Look forward to seeing you on part two.